Good morning. These are historic times in our nation and our community and in the life of our church. These times call for unique solutions to everyday opportunities. That said, let me welcome you to FBC's first ever life study group in an electronic format. Since this is our first attempt, we hope that you will be tolerant but encouraged as we at First Baptist Church of Paris work to continue to provide a vibrant worship experience while we are adapting to our nation's challenges in dealing with the coronavirus. In 1841, the African-American violinist Solomon Northup was a free man. The 2013 movie, 12 Years a Slave, reenacts the true life experiences of Solomon Northup. As a free black man, Northup was living with his wife and his children in Saratoga Springs, New York. He's hired by two men to work for a 2-week tour of Washington with their theatrical company. However, Solomon is betrayed and kidnapped and sold as a slave in New Orleans. There, Solomon is given the nickname of Platt. For the next 12 years, he works in the Old South plantation system, enduring all of the inhumanity and the abuse of a pre-Civil War slave in America. One day he meets a Canadian abolitionist named Samuel Bass, and Bass promises to send a letter to Solomon's family in New York. That chance interaction establishes a pathway to freedom for Solomon Northup. Perhaps there is no greater injustice than to enslave another person. This movie is a reminder of the fragile nature of freedom and how cultures and cultural norms can drive enslavement. Paul's New Testament letter to the Galatian Christians addresses this issue of spiritual enslavement driven by misguided religion. The tendency of the Jewish religious elitists of Paul's day was to distort and conform the gospel to achieve a selfish motive and to spiritually enslave early Christians. Paul sought in these verses to remind these Galatian Christians and you and me that we have been freed from the slavery of religiosity. That in Christ we are free from restrictive and meaningless ritual and custom. That we live under grace and not under a law of compliance and condemnation. The Galatia of Paul's time was a part of a region located in what is modern-day Turkey. Most of the people who lived in Galatia were Gentiles and non-Jews. Paul visited this region at least twice, and he had preached the good news about Jesus to many Galatian Gentiles, and they were converted and became Christians. The book of Acts documents Paul's ministry in Galatia. And the Gentile Christians in Galatia had believed the good news about Jesus when Paul was a missionary there with them. But after Paul left, the Jewish false teachers had infiltrated the Galatian church and began teaching a gospel of compliance. These false teachers may have been ordinary Jews, but they may have been Jews who claimed to trust in Jesus. However, these Jews were jealous of Paul, and they had spoken against him, and they said that Paul was not an apostle. And they taught that Christians had to obey the Jewish ritual laws of the Old Testament. These old laws spiritually enslaved and controlled people. Some of the Christians in Galatia believed these false teachers. Paul heard of these events, and he became concerned about his Galatian friends in the church there. So he wrote this letter to teach them the truth once again. And he reminded them about the true liberty that faith in Jesus delivers. And beginning with the first verse of chapter 5, he again reminds them of the gospel of Jesus Christ. These first 6 verses of chapter 5 of the book of Galatians establish a context for the verses that I want us to focus on this morning. So as we begin, let's start with those first few verses of chapter 5 in Galatians that are the foundation for verses 7 through 15 that will become our focus this morning. And Paul writes, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again that every man who accepts circumcision, that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love." Paul said, Christ has set us free from restrictive, condemning constraints, those constraints that were the basis of old Jewish law. And he reminds these Galatian Christians that nothing matters for those of us who accept Christ but our faith manifested by our active love. So now let's look at, beginning in verse 7 of chapter 5 of Galatians, let's look at what Paul teaches these Christians. "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who called you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and no one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves." As a Pharisee, Paul was versed in the law and understood its teaching. He knew that there was no space in the gospel for law-driven righteousness. Paul was keenly aware that for these Christians to now accept the law as authoritative was contrary to the truth and the freedom of the gospel. So he is compelled to challenge this new direction of these Galatian Christians. Paul began this passage by asking a piercing question: what has happened to you? You were doing so well, and why have you turned away from the gospel and from grace? You have re-embraced the imperfect confinements, the slavery of the law. We must remember that the law was rooted in condemnation, not grace. The law of Moses was prohibitive and was about punishment and negative reinforcement. Who would have led you to this negative path, Paul asked. And Paul likens the message of negativity to yeast that impacts the entire batch of dough. But he reminds them of their commitment to the gospel's precepts. Paul here demonstrates a key component of his leadership. That component is his confidence in Christ. It would take 2,000 years to codify confidence as a leadership technique. In an article, Marcel Swartnes writes this about how confidence translates into leadership and trust. The foundation for everything related to your leadership has to be built on trust. In his book, The Speed of Trust, Stephen Covey writes that a team with high trust will produce results faster and at a lower cost. Conventional thinking says that people have to earn trust first. But it's been found that in healthy organizations, leaders with a servant mindset are willing to give trust to their followers first, and they give it as a gift even before it's earned. That is exactly what Paul did with these Galatian Christians. Paul here uses his confidence to regenerate their trust in him and his message of the gospel, but more importantly, their trust in the completeness and the liberation of the gospel. Building on that trust, he encouraged these Galatian Christians to keep their faith and to reject false teachings. His message of clinging to the gospel and rejecting cultural norms of legalism is a wonderful message for the modern church as well. Now, we don't today deal with cultural norms demanded by Mosaic law. We are, however, pressed on every side by the expectations of our culture. Expectations like material success and career and social status. All of these are social norms that bring about stresses and fears and worries that compromise the freedom that is offered so simply by the gospel. We would do well to look at Paul's teachings and to cling first to the simplicity of the gospel when the complex and unrealistic demands of our lives press in. In verse 13 and 14, Paul continues, "For you were called to freedom, brothers." I love that phrase. I love that part of this passage. "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in the word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." We often use this word freedom and use it to describe a range of human situations and conditions. But what does freedom really mean? There are literally thousands of definitions available for that word. And is it really possible to define freedom? Certainly, freedom can be defined by a range of definitions based on a person's particular circumstance. But I found this one that I like, and I think it really fits here in this situation. Freedom is the ability to choose for any creature living life in any place at any time. There's no greater truth to the statement and no underlying meaning. Freedom is simply the ability to choose. I think Paul's use of the word here aligns with this definition. You are called to freedom, brothers, meaning you have the ability to choose. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. So he said, use your freedom wisely. But through love, serve one another, meaning use freedom, the freedom provided by the gospel, as a platform for serving and loving each other. Paul said that the gospel is really pretty simple, that love is the product of gospel's freedom well applied in our lives. A complex world often pursues complex solutions to the human dilemma. Paul said that this existence well lived need not be complex, that simple is better. Ed Strauss, the author of 150 need-to-know Bible facts, agrees with Paul. Strauss writes, it was a small command tucked away in a dry book of ceremonial laws. It wasn't even listed among the 10 Commandments. Yet these 7 simple words in Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, are the heart of the law. The law of Moses was strict and complicated. Jesus' message was merciful and simple. Love God and love the person next to you. Do that, and you just fulfilled all the requirements of the law. Talk about keeping things simple. I think Paul and Ed Strauss agree here. When we embrace and exercise the freedom that is our gift of the gospel of Christ, it is manifested simply as love for each other. Our faith is not really a complicated endeavor. Simply love each other. Love your neighbor as yourself. That is how we exercise the freedom that is ours in the gospel of Christ. Paul finishes here in verse 15 of this passage, "But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." Paul concludes this section of this passage with this warning about dissension in the church. I like the commentary from the Life Application Bible for this passage. When we believers lose our motivation of love, we become critical of others. We stop looking for the good in them, and we see only their faults. Soon we lose our unity. Have you ever talked behind someone's back? Have you ever focused on another's shortcomings instead of their strengths? Remind yourself of Jesus' command from Matthew 22:39, to love others as you love yourself. When you begin to feel critical of someone, make a list of that person's positive qualities. When problems need to be more openly addressed, confront in love rather than gossip. I think this is advice that is timeless in application. For us to love each other, we must support each other. For us to love each other means that we bear each other's troubles. To love each other means that we must protect each other. For us to love each other, we must be willing to support each other. And we must avoid the entrapments of jealousy and selfishness that rob us of our freedom provided by the gospel of Christ. Now, I know that's way too long for a bumper sticker, but the message is no less powerful. The true story of Solomon Northrop can be an ageless reminder of the fragile nature of freedom. By whatever definition we apply, freedom can be lost. Sometimes, as in the case of Solomon Northrop, freedom was taken. But the Galatian Christians, for them, the loss of freedom was the result of their voluntary compliance with false teachings. The message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is complete and simple. The gospel promises that we are free from slavery and unnecessary cultural prescriptions, that we are free from the fear, dread, and worry that would compromise the quality of our lives. Those cultural aspects are the slavery that can keep us from being free to love each other as the gospel teaches us. The promise of the gospel of Christ is that we are free. We're no longer slaves. The lyrics of one of my favorite modern hymns speaks to this very issue. Zach Williams' lyrics to the song "No Longer Slaves" read like a poem. You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies till my fears are gone. I am no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I am no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. This week, let's cling to that promise of freedom guaranteed by the gospel of Christ. And this week, let's remember that we are no longer slaves. We are God's children. We are freed slaves, freed to love Him, freed to love each other. Thank you, and have a great week.